Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's a review for Star Trek Discovery Season 1, Episode 6, Lethe. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Discovery, so I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Season 1, up to Season 1, Episode 6. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video. Otherwise, some things may be spoiled for you. So before I get into this episode proper, I want to talk about a few theories, a few fan theories. Because the fan theories on Discovery are just flowing around. It's like getting as bad as Game of Thrones, really. It surprised all the theories people are coming up with. And most of them, I'm going to be honest, are dumb. And I don't mean to be rude, but I just got to be blunt. And I just got to say out that some of these theories are just no. And the worst one that I've heard, that's actually probably the most prevalent, the one I've heard the most, is, what if Star Trek Discovery is actually set in the mirror universe? Woo! Okay, and the reasoning people come up with this theory is, well, everyone's an asshole, so they must be evil from the mirror universe. Is Captain Jellicoe evil? Is fucking Admiral Pressman evil? Is Captain Ransom evil? I'm sorry, I'm sick. I bring up these people almost every single review of Discovery, but that's because I feel I have to, because so many of these Star Trek fanboys really don't get it. This is nothing new to Star Trek. It's just this is the first series that focuses more on these type of elements that have always been in Starfleet from the original series to Next Generation. Every single fucking incarnation of Star Trek has had Starfleet assholes. Deal with it. It doesn't mean they're in the goddamn mirror universe. And also, they're not talking about a Terran Empire. They're not wearing the clothes. They're not going like this. They're not freaking going to random planets and annihilating everyone. They're not in the fucking mirror universe. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Just, they're assholes, so they must mean it. And then there's the other theory, which is, I guess, more plausible, but I'm still not buying, that it's just Lorca himself that's from the mirror universe. And I think this episode in particular, which I'll get into shortly, goes a lot into explaining Lorca, why he is the way he is. And it's not because he's from an evil universe. It's more complex than that. And again, Ransom, Garth of Izar, Admiral Pressman, I can go Admiral Jellicoe, Captain Jellicoe, all these people. Having an asshole as a Starfleet captain is nothing new in the Star Trek universe. So just stop that. Stop it. And the other thing is, regardless of mirror universe, and there's other people who are saying, this must be a new parallel universe we haven't seen before, because they're all acting like assholes and things don't line up exactly as they do in Trek. And this is these kind of annoying theories are thanks to the whole J.J. Kelvin timeline bullshit, which again I'm very much against. I hate the Kelvin timeline. I hate the J.J. Abrams movies. They're dumb. They're not Star Trek in my opinion. Discovery is, but they're not. And because of that, it's got people in this mindset that if something doesn't fit perfectly into established lore, then it must be a parallel universe, because Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and even Enterprise have always done these slight inconsistencies, slightly against continuity, slightly against that, in Star Trek all the time. And when they did it, no one was like, this must be a parallel universe. But because of the fucking Kelvin timeline, and because frankly the producers decided that the show needed the same aesthetic look of the Kelvin bullshit, now everyone's going, every time something's even slightly off, they're like, parallel universe! Just, ugh. The producers, everyone involved in the show has said again and 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 again, it's set in the prime timeline. Deal with it! Alright? Anyway. But the thing is, the same people who have been saying these ridiculous theories actually come up with this one theory that I actually think I didn't come up on my own. I actually think it's a really good theory. In fact, when I watch a show, I operate like my mind assumes this theory is correct because it makes perfect sense to me. And that's the theory that Lieutenant Ash, who we met in the previous episode, who was in prison, and Lorca rescued him, and now in this episode, Lorca makes him the new chief of security, that he's actually a Klingon in disguise. Not just any Klingon, but Vork, the sort of, I don't know if that's how you say his name, but that's how I'll say it. But the albino Klingon who was first seen in the pilot episode and later appeared in a previous episode. And we haven't seen him since. So, and last we saw him, he was with that, again, I can't remember her name, but the Klingon woman who appeared to betray him to this other, I think, Cole, who's from the House Core, and Core is a sort of classic Klingon who's been in the original series Deep Space Nine. But anyway, that last time we saw, she betrayed him, but then she went to him and said, actually, I did this to save your life, and I have a plan for you. And we never saw what that plan was. We saw her again, as she was the one who was holding the prisoners, but we didn't see him. So I think it's very likely that the plan was for him to go undercover as a human, and that's why he was in her jail cell. And there was this implied sort of relationship between them. We saw him we saw Lieutenant Ash kicking the shit out of this woman, but it could be that was Vork, and he was doing it partly for show and partly for getting her back, because she sort of had him suffer as an act in order to save him, so he could say, oh, well, I'm going to beat the shit out of you in order to keep up my act, which I think would make... So this theory actually makes perfect sense. It's very in line with Star Trek. It's been established in the original series. Everyone keeps bringing this up. The trouble with tribbles, there was this Arn Darvin, I think his name was, who was a human, who was actually Klingon in disguise. And whenever anyone brings him up, they also point out the fact that the way he was discovered to be a Klingon spy was by a tribble, and guess what Captain Lorca has in his ready room? So people are guessing that when Lieutenant Ash walks in that ready room, the tribble's going to go, and possibly, and maybe at this stage, since they maybe don't know much about tribbles, and maybe Captain Lorca isn't going to know the significance of why the tribble's freaking out around Lieutenant Ash. Would be interesting. So whenever I see Lieutenant Ash, my mind just goes straight to thinking Vork. Now, this theory could be wrong. It's just a theory done by the same people who said the mirror universe bullshit. But I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think that this theory, So I think that's sort of what I operate when I'm watching the show. I'm pretty sure, because it all adds up in my mind. Anyway, let's move on and talk about the episode proper. So this episode was actually pretty good. I think it was a lot better than last week's. I don't think it was one of the best. It was kind of on the okay line. I mean, I think it was probably, again, the thing that Discovery is consistently best at is character stories, and the character stories in this episode were really great. Particularly, it explored Michael Burnham and Captain Lorca. We got a lot of interesting background on both characters, so I thought it was interesting from that perspective. Okay, so getting into the episode, so the main plot. Mainly was about Sarek. Now, every time Sarek is going to appear, I'm probably going to renew my objections to having Sarek in the show, where it should have just been, they should have created a new Vulcan character, but I have to move beyond that because tough titties, they have Sarek in there, so I just have to learn to deal with it. But I do like the way they used him in this episode. I do think it was really good use of him. And of course, we got a first appearance of Amanda, even though she was a bit younger. But there we go. And name dropping Spock, of course. But actually, this didn't feel shoehorned in like a lot of these other Star Trek references. Like the last time Michael Burnham mentioned Amanda, was like, But this time it felt more natural. It felt like natural to the plot. And so, actually, alright, well, first let's start off with this mind meld connection thing, because this was actually first brought up in the pilot episodes. And I was never sort of on board with this. Now they're explaining that he uses Katra to save her life, and they're sort of connected. Now I'm kind of thinking of like there's that quote from The Force Awakens where Han Solo says, "That's not how the Force works," and a lot of people sort of redo it to mean different things. So I kind of picture him saying, "That's not how Katra works." Like that's not really how it was described in Star Trek 3. Really, it was just made up as an excuse to bring Spock back to life, if we're being perfectly honest. But I mean, again, I'm not going to cry parallel universe, because it is a sort of mysticism and is something that's more fantastical. So if Discovery wants to skirt that line in order to serve their particular storytelling purposes, fine, I'll give them that. I don't really have an issue with it. I mean, not a big one anyway. So I'll just go with it. And if I just go with it, I do find that it's really good storytelling. I do love the fact that there's this connection between them, and I love the way this was handled, because we had a lot of other like people going inside people's minds episodes in Star Trek before. Deep Space Nine did this several times, and this is probably one of my best uses, my personal favorite uses of that device, that I think worked pretty well. Because it told a really great personal story. And again, I love getting this background on Burnham and how she had this Vulcan upbringing. Because whenever we see her in the past, she is like straight-faced Vulcan. But in the present, she's not so much. She has hints of Vulcanness. But you can see her human characteristics come out a bit more. And some people criticize this and saying that the actress is a bad actress because she's a bit flat. But I completely cannot disagree more. I think she's an amazing actress and playing this mix between humanity and the Vulcanological side perfectly. But that's just me. So I always love getting the more background. And I love this particular scene, how... I just love the way it played out, how she assumed that he was being reminded that she was a failure, and because that's what she thought. Whenever she went back to her memory, her first thought was, I failed him because I failed to get into this academy, and so he thinks of me as a failure. And I love how Ash, Lieutenant Ash, how he pointed out that it was... that someone near death wouldn't be thinking of the people who failed them. They would be thinking about their own failures and regrets. And I love that. And I love that made her realize, I love that interaction, how she realized that it was her, he was feeling regret. So she went and found the truth. And I love this, that it was the fact that the Vulcan Academy said, okay, you have these two human children. He's like, Spock's not human. He's like, half human. Oh, she's only half Vulcan, so they still consider him an outsider. And so basically he's dealing with prejudice. And so they forced him to choose, and he chooses Spock. And of course, the Trekkies, in the room are rewarded because they instantly know that Spock refused to go to this Vulcan Academy, and that's why Sarek hated him and had a sort of sour relationship with him. And now this sort of builds up that even more. They do explain this for the non-initiated later in the episode, just to be clear. And this fills in a plot hole that I had in the first episode, because when Sarek brought Burnham to Starfleet, I thought, well, this is inconsistent of Sarek, because Sarek hated Spock for going into Starfleet, so it seemed like he hated Starfleet, so why would he take his adopted daughter and purposely embrace Starfleet? But now it makes perfect sense that the reason why he was so upset with Spock is because he gave up the chance of one of his children going to this science academy for him, and that Burnham actually should have been the one that went to the Vulcan science. I don't know. I keep calling it academy, but it's like a directorate or whatever the fuck it is. But anyway, that she should have went into that, and he gave that up for Spock, and he squandered it. So that makes perfect sense on why he was upset with Spock. It makes everything in the original series more in retrospect makes sense. Now, obviously, this is something the writers came up with in retrospect to justify why things were different. But, I think it works. I think it works brilliantly, actually. And I love the dynamic this set between Burnham and Sarek. And I love the scene at the end where he wasn't really willing to talk about it, but she said, and she was like sort of forcing, he didn't acknowledge they were family, but he was sort of forcing it on him, saying father and being more forceful. And I love that. It sets up a really interesting dynamic between the two of them. Although I still wish that it wasn't Sarek, that was another new Vulcan character, but I gotta move beyond that eventually. Maybe eventually I'll accept this, but I still think it really worked. It was a great character story. I loved the way it all fit together. It was perfect. Now, let me talk about the Vulcans, because I know there's going to be some people who are claiming that this is out of character for the Vulcans, because first of all, we have a sort of splinter group in the Vulcans, like a rebel faction that they're kind of like the neo-Nazis of the Vulcans, where they're all purists. They want to keep Vulcan for Vulcan and don't want the humans and don't want to be involved with the Federation and think the humans are infectious. Now, if you just go off of what you know from the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, I can get the impression why you might think that's un-Star Trek-like, but it is very much in keeping with what's been established in Enterprise, which is actually closer to the time period than any of the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager stuff. In fact, if you think of just the original series, Vulcans were never actually shown to being that close to humans. So it doesn't really contradict stuff there. And it's completely in keeping with Enterprise, because Enterprise, whether you like it or not, has established that the Vulcans were dicks to humans, basically, when humans were first going out into space, and they really thought of them as inferior. They treated them like shit. Now, we did see in the later fourth season of Enterprise how they evolved and they started to be more accepting to the humans and got to the point where they weren't treating them like shit and they joined the Federation. So that makes sense that that's where mainstream Vulcan would be 100 years from then, which is when this series takes place approximately 100 years after Enterprise, somewhat. So that makes sense that's where to be now, but it makes absolute perfect sense that even though the majority, like the mainstream Vulcan, has embraced humanity and intermingling with other species, other non-logic based species, that not all Vulcans would be that way, that there would be a splinter group of some who hold on to these ways which are really only 100 years old. They're not distant thousands of years. Just 100 years ago, they thought they were superior to all non-logical races and were being dicks to everyone. So it makes sense there'd still be a small group of people still holding on to that. So I thought that fit with Enterprise beautifully. And then we get to the bigotry with the Vulcan telling Sarek that his children are too human and he has to choose between them because they can't have two humans-ish, and how they're not. And they sort of question Sarek about marrying a woman and a human woman and integrating humanity into Vulcan. They accepted that's an eventuality, but they're still not completely on board with this. So they're there's only so much we can take. So it was bigotry. And again, lines up absolutely perfectly with Enterprise, because Enterprise, which again only 100 years previous, the whole prospect of a human-Vulcan mating was seen disgusting, not just by the humans but also by the Vulcans. It seemed like it was impossible. Vulcan and human have no business mating or being together. Now we see that it's accepted, which makes sense, it's 100 years later, but it's only accepted to a certain extent. And again, it's only been 100 years, so that makes perfect sense. So I think what they did here with the Vulcans, I was impressed with how well it fit into the Enterprise lore. I'll put it that way. So I think that was beautiful. So I overall, I pretty much liked the storyline. Okay, so let's move over to the Captain Lorca and Admiral Cornwell storyline. Now, okay, so first of all, let me get this out of the way. When Cornwell comes on board, she tells Captain Lorca off for what Stamets did and applying eugenics or whatever, and wants to punish Stamets. Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking serious? She's criticizing a chief engineer for doing something that only affected himself. He put his life on the line to stop the torture and murder of an innocent sentient being done by or ordered by a Starfleet commander who had no business of ordering people to kill an innocent sentient being, and she has the nerve to complain about Stamets? Stamets, not fucking Saru. Saru's the one who should be court-martialed. What the fuck? See, this is the thing that gives the Mirror Universe people fodder, because this does seem like a different universe. This doesn't seem like Star Trek. This doesn't seem like Starfleet. This doesn't seem like the actual Prime Universe for them to say, oh, let's arrest a person who risked his own life. I could just imagine Picard getting red-faced and going off in these angry lectures. It's like, how dare you, life is sacred, blah, blah, blah. Even Kirk would do this if he wants something closer to the time period. It's completely unacceptable. Anyway, that has a lot more to do with my complaints about the previous episode, which I talked about in the previous episodes. I don't want to rehash it here, but still, what the fuck, Stamets? It's like the writers have no clue of how much of a homicidal, torturous madman they portrayed Saru. It's like they don't know. But anyway, moving beyond that, let's talk. I want to actually talk about something that Cornwell said. And I think in that same very scene that I actually loved. I was applauding in my head as soon as she said this. She said, "You were just tortured and held on a Klingon ship for a week, and that just doesn't go away. You know, that's something that stays with you." Now, I was doing like a slow clap. Now, if you're confused on why I love this so much, and honestly, I think this is a milestone for Star Trek, and this is something I think Discovery has above all of the other Star Trek shows: continuity. Alright, so there's nameless examples. It's like the episodic nature of the previous Star Trek shows that really pissed me off. And I'm rewatching Voyager at the moment, and Voyager is arguably the worst Star Trek show when it comes to continuity. So Voyager is notorious for hitting that reset button as hard as they fucking can after every episode. I mean, you can argue that the original series was just as bad. I think Next Generation was more consistent because at least it had reoccurring characters like the Traveler, Barclay, whatever. And you could argue that the original series was just as bad or worse. But see, the thing is that the nature of Voyager required continuity more than the original series. So I'd argue that Voyager was worse, and that's the worst series about doing this. But neither here nor there. There are examples in this specific thing about someone being tortured and it having lasting effect in pretty much all the Star Trek shows. So there's Next Generation, where Picard was held and tortured by the Cardassians, the whole four lights, and at the end of the episode, he's like talking to Counselor Troy and talking about how it devastated him, how affected he was by it. Very next episode, he's fine, never talked about again. Deep Space Nine had an episode where O'Brien was had this 40-year prison sentence put inside his head. So according to him, it was like he was in prison for the past 40 years, where he murdered his cellmate, who was his best friend, and it's really affected him very badly. And at the end of the episode, they're saying he would have to have constant therapy, and it would take years for him to recover. Next episode, he's fine. Never talked about again. In Next Generation, again, there's the episode where Geordi LaForge was captured by the Romulans, and he was brainwashed into killing like Klingons and people against his will, and he had no memory of this. He had these fake memories of him being on Risa. So at the end of the episode, he was in a counseling session with Counselor Troy, where she was saying like it was going to take a long time for him to accept what really happened to him and move beyond it. It would take lots of therapy. You see where I'm going with this. Never talked about again. He was perfectly okay the next episode. So I absolutely love, like, this is such a great thing, a huge giant plus on Discovery. That line where she said, "You were tortured, this is something you just don't get over, and you shouldn't just go back as if everything's normal, like all the other fucking Star Trek episodes do." And I love that. I love it. This is what I wanted to see in Star Trek, a sense of consequence, of continuity, of things having effect. Now I know, like, Deep Space Nine Enterprise did do this a lot, and they got better at it, although from time to time they were guilty themselves of hitting that reset button. But at least they, made an effort. So Discovery is by far the best at keeping the continuity, and I love that. I think that is absolutely great. And I got in comments before where people were like, specifically on my review for last week's episode, which I was quite negative, and people were like, well, you're being negative because you're looking at it as a Star Trek show. We shouldn't look at it as a Star Trek show. You should look at it as any other sci-fi show. But I very strongly disagree, because the word Star Trek appeared in the title. So if they are going to use the word Star Trek, then they need to be judged on the basis of being a Star Trek show, because it's not just a sci-fi show, it is a Star Trek show. You can see the words right there in the title, so you have to judge it by that standard. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Just like for this example, like if this was just a normal sci-fi show, I wouldn't care that much about the whole line about being tortured, but because it's a Star Trek show, it makes me think very much better of it. It makes me think it's good. So it's not always a negative to view it as a Star Trek show. And I know a lot of the fanboys are saying that it shouldn't have the word Star Trek. It should just be a normal sci-fi show. But I very, very, very strongly disagree. I want to see another Star Trek. I'm glad that the show has the title Star Trek to it for times like this, and I do think it's time to move Star Trek in a slightly different direction. But there's a lot of things that still do tie into Star Trek, and I love it. Anyway, digress. Let me get to the core of this Lorca and Cornwell stuff. And I was really disappointed when they when they started having sex and they revealed that they had a prior sexual relationship. It was kind of hinted at in the previous scene, but I was hoping that they were just friends. And because it's just so cliche for them to be lovers, and I was just like, oh god, that is a negative. But what happened after the sex scene was kind of incredible. How Lorca just turned on her and put a phaser to her, and it does show that she's right, that he has some mental issues having to do with losing his ship, and maybe it was exasperated by being tortured. And he feels guilty for his crew dying. By the way, I didn't talk about this much last week, but we found out that's the reason why he doesn't fix his eyes, his aversion to the light, is because he does it purposely to remind himself, because he wants to feel pain over the loss. So he's had some psychological issues. And I love how, Cornwell, recognizes this, maybe rightfully so, says, you're not fit to be in command. I'm going to take your command and wait till you get better. Now, here's the question I have. Because as soon as Burnham came back to the ship and said that Sarek wasn't fit to go in this peace meeting with the Klingons, he was all too eager to offer up Cornwell. He passed it up like it would be her idea, like she would want to do it. But I was very suspicious of him from the beginning, and I'm still not sure if it was his plan all along for her to get captured or killed, if he knew that it was a trap. Like, once it happened and the trap was sprung, it's like, Lorca knew this. But maybe he didn't. Because how could he know? Like, I'm not sure how he would know it was an actual trap. I think he was just hoping that it was a trap, or hoping that something would go wrong. Because it's obvious that he was sort of pushing her to go. And it could be he had no idea. For all he knew, everything could have went fine, and she would have came back perfectly okay. But as soon as he heard that she was captured, he wasn't going out of his way. Like, they made it very obvious with that scene with him talking to Saru, where Saru, that fucking madman, was like, why don't we just break the rules like we always done? Just like when I tried to torture and kill it. No, I'm never going to let this go. Sorry, I'm not. But anyway, Lorca's like, no, we're gonna let this go. We're gonna forget about this, and we'll play it by the book. So, very obvious that he knew the book would leave her captured, because then she wouldn't be able to take. And that does. Now I know all the people are going to go, Mirror Universe, a bullshitter. Or like, that's on Star Trek. I like to have a Starfleet captain purposely, do that to an admiral, blah, 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 blah. For people like that, I have 3 words for you. 3 words. Garth of Izar. And if you're a Star Trek geek, you know what that means, and you know I just won the argument. There you go. Because this wouldn't be the first example of a Starfleet captain who is mentally unfit to command, but is in command anyway. And I love that. It's just the first time that we're focusing on this. And this is something like in the Comic-Con, New York Comic-Con, at this Discovery panel, like, people asked them directly, why is this show got a darker tone? And they said, one of the main reasons was because it's serialized. And being serialized, you actually deal with the consequences. Like in the City of the Edge of Forever, Kirk was depressed after either Keeler died. You just wipe that clean and you move on to a different episode. It's like it never happened. Whereas in a serialized show, you don't wipe it clean. You deal with the consequences. And so it seems a bit more dark because of that. I would argue it has more to do with the fact it's set in wartime, which is also why Deep Space Nine was dark, particularly in this last couple seasons. But yeah, I do agree that does have something to do with it. And again, I love this continuity. I love that they're, doing something different. So anyway, people like this, mentally unstable, asshole Starfleet warmongering captains have always existed in Star Trek. Always. This is just the first time we're focusing on them. And war is always, even in the original series, there was a war that broke out between the Klingons and Starfleet in the episode Errand of Mercy. So war is nothing new either. It's just the first time we're focusing on it on a serialized basis rather than just doing it for one episode and swiping the slate clean afterwards. And again, that's Discovery is one of its biggest strengths to me. It's the fact that it is serialized. Oh yeah, one last thing I want to talk about that I forgot to mention is this scene where as soon as I saw it, I could just picture in my head like a lot of Trekkies' heads just exploding. As the training scene where we see Lorca and Ash training with their weapons and killing a bunch of Klingons, and then they say, I don't think they say computer in program, but they say the equivalent. It turns out that was all just the holograms. I could just see all the Trekkies' heads explode at the very moment where the holograms disappeared. What? There are no holodecks in the original series time period. Holodecks were not invented until Next Generation. What the fuck is this? This is inconsistent parallel universe, inconsistent, not canon, blah, 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 blah. And if I'm going to be perfectly honest, it did bother me a little bit as well. And the more I think about it, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be the excuse, because if you notice whenever these Trekkies go crazy, being like, this is inconsistent with canon, the producers will always come on and be like, come up with an excuse. Well, actually, you could say this fits into canon because of blah, blah, blah. They refer to it as skirting canon. So obviously it's just something they want to do, so they come up with an excuse to placate the Trekkies, which never does because their heads explode anyway. But I can imagine what they'd say in this circumstance, and I actually think it's a pretty good piece of reasoning because I came up with it myself, but I can imagine they'd say this anyway, is that this wasn't a holodeck. It didn't have the grid. They didn't say computer in program. It actually, I'll have to rewatch the scene, but it seemed to me like it didn't like fake space like holodecks do. Like holodecks will have these grand landscapes like you're on a planet, and it makes it look like there's a horizon going for miles, but really the room ends a couple meters from you. It just creates the illusion. I don't think this particular thing did that. I think, if I remember correctly, I think the space they were in was the same. It just created sort of the environment. It made them think they were back on that Klingon ship, and it created a bunch of Klingon holograms for them to kill. So what I would say is that this is a earlier version of a holodeck. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, since 100 or so years from now, they will have full-on holodecks that can do amazing stuff. It doesn't really make sense that they go from 0 to 100, that there would be no holotechnology, and then all of a sudden this is amazing holotechnology. It makes sense that there'd be prototypes, there'd be earlier versions that can do some of the hologram stuff, but just not as impressive a holodeck, and I think that's what we saw. And of course, you know, you could say, well, but we never saw this in the original series. This is something like that Discovery has to do, because the original series, we had little knobs in the computer going, working. It was made in the 60s. Sorry, but you're making something in the 2017, you have to make it seem more realistic to be in the future of 2017. And so they integrated the hologram technology, because that does seem actually not that far off from the future, if I'm being perfectly honest. So they have to do it in order to make sense for the time frame that we're in. So there are inevitably going to be inconsistencies with the original series because of that fact. And you could argue that the fact that holodeck even exists in Next Generation time is a slight inconsistency from the original series, because again, 100 years from then, all of a sudden they have this amazing holodeck technology with no prototypes. So and it didn't bother me smudging, but in the end, like, I'm okay with it. And if they come up with that excuse that it was, a prototype holodeck, I'm fine with that. I think that makes sense. I think they do what they have to do to make Discovery fit into our time period, and that's fine. I got no issues with it. I'm not going to scream, not canon, or any of that bullshit. So I'm okay with it. So, my rating for Lethe out of 10 is going to be a 8, extremely good. And to be honest, I was originally planning to give this a 7 when I started this review, but the more I talked about it, the more I think this is actually a better episode. I don't know if I call it the best episode of the season so far, but it is one of the better ones, in my opinion. There were some issues I had here and there with, of course, Cornwell blaming Stamets, which is just fucking outrageous. But again, that has more to do with my complaints about the previous episode. This episode is actually a very good character building episode for both Burnham and Lorca. And I don't care what any of these Trekkie fanboys say, I love the fact that Lorca is seen to have mental issues and he shouldn't really be in command. I love it. And I think this sets up some really great storytelling possibilities, and I can't wait to see where they take it from here. So that's it for my review of Lethe. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of Star Trek Discovery, and be sure to check out my channel for many other videos I do on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.